huge thanks for the invitation to be here. Um, Lovely place with lovely people. I am honoured and a little bit nervous about to be the first speaker, but I've kind of used it as an opportunity to. This is a much shorter version of a much longer thing that I've been working on for a while. It's an ongoing piece of work. I really welcome feedback, questions. It's intended as a kind of provocation, as a opening point for a larger conversation. So I will leave the nuanced, interesting, granular work to everybody else. So how do we do visual culture in an age of network computation? I'm going to start with a really important observation made by Katrina Lewis and Daniel Rubinstein back in 2008. That photography today is a two-faced Janus. It's image and it's data. So you've got the representational content of the image on the one hand, but then you've got the kind of image as a thing, as a pocket of data that is operationalized as part of a vast infrastructure comprising many and varied things. And so the kind of first simple observation is that historically, and I think potentially still today, and analysis and day-to-day encounter focuses on the representational content of images. Right? It's still primarily we think about, well, what is in the image? What's the world in there? But I don't think it's enough to think instead about infrastructure. I mean, that's something I've kind of spent some time doing in the past, is kind of mapping this world of content moderators and coltan miners and server farms. And I think then one loses sight of the image. And so, say the kind of second relatively simple observation is I think we need to do both at the same time. I think this is, and I think we need metaphors that enable us to identify what it is to do the two things at the same time, to think about the relationship between the two, the extent to which they are indivisible, the extent to which they're distinct. We could call this, on the one hand, this is what Stimson and Kelsey call the world in here and the world out there. Or it's what Martha Rosler calls in and around photography. So I think we need approaches to visual culture that think about image and infrastructure simultaneously. And so I'm going to do three things. I'm going to kind of introduce a metaphor. And I'm going to do the slightly kind of perverse task of trying to think, what does image and infrastructure look like as image? Right? What would it be to provide a single image that somehow demonstrates something about this relationship between image and infrastructure? And then I want to kind of slightly complicate my own argument by thinking about this all in a slightly different way. So my proposal is extracorporeal images. So an extracorporeal procedure is a procedure that takes place outside the body. So in dialysis, for example, blood flows from the human patient through a machine where waste products and excess fluid are removed, and it goes back into the body. So I'm not interested in the first instance about the function of the machine. Right, we could come to that. I think there's kind of interesting things that could be spoken about in terms of the function of the machine. I'm talking about the relationship between the machine and the human, the extent to which they remain distinct from one another, but also in another way, they are absolutely indivisible. And that in the context of a patient's extracorporeal treatment, each relies on and sustains the other, the human to be a function as a human and the machine to function as a machine. And so the kind of the analogy, the translation I'm suggesting is that we think about the body would be the image. It would be the representational content of the image, the human body. And then the machine is the infrastructure. And so we have a sense of the two interpenetrating is Michelle Henning's term, sustaining one another somehow, but also, maybe there's a separation still possible. So we'll move on to some reflections on what this could look like. And so this is essentially looking to art practice for kind of a pedagogical function, I guess, art practice as a guide to how we could do or think about visual culture. And I'm going to look at three art projects as examples of what I'm describing as extracorporeal images. So the first is from a series called Sewn by the artist Andrew Norman Wilson, which was an artwork in the form of a startup. It specialized in the production of stock imagery that would more accurately reflect people's experiences of capitalism following the 2008 financial crisis. Um, so it's a kind of Swiftian tale, if you will, that if capitalism was going to kind of regain the trust of the masses, they were going to have to be much more honest. The corporations would be much more honest about the effects of capital on our kind of collective psyche. So much less of this, and much more of this as kind of the self-image of unchecked neoliberalism. Um, and so it took the form of a series of image concepts. So they were texts initially that Wilson invited funders to fund the realization of the texts. And so the image concepts include a drunk CEO sobbing into a KLM airplane blanket while taking an automated HSBC customer satisfaction survey, and branded smoke billowing from an ATM machine. And there's also one about a Amazon warehouse worker having a kind of violent revenge on a corporate. Um, and so investors would invest in the realization of these image concepts, and then they would make a return on their investment, both through the sale of these things as stock imagery via things like Getty and iStock, but also as kind of rarefied commodities on the art market. So it's a kind of attempt to kind of retool the art economy. Um, Now, why I'm interested in them is Wilson said that he kind of pointed to the fact that a lot of these images show the psychological effects of precarious work. Right, this is a kind of effort to allegorize what it is to inhabit brutal capitalist social relations that leave us crying or desperate or angry or confused. And actually, a lot of them were going to be used by precarious workers in various parts of an image economy, insofar as these would be freelance journalists or freelance picture editors or people in the art world. And so there was this weird rhyming between uh, how these things circulated, how they were owned, how they were being monetized, the kind of the labor involved, and the thing that the picture depicted. So that's the kind of the extracorporeal element, whereby there's this kind of sense of the infrastructure ingrained within the image through the process through which the image is made and circulated. So my second example is associations by the artist Ed Fornielas. So he makes these by he likens it to surrealist automatic writing. So he starts with an image and then he kind of tries to put himself into a kind of meditative, almost trance-like state. And then one image begets another image, begets another image. So it's kind of via various interactions with the network, whether that's reverse image searches or stock image databases or social media archives. And when we think about how the patterns were produced, he kind of has one image and then he finds something that either has a visual association or a conceptual association or a personal association. What we see are kind of traces or trails produced through this kind of traveling through the network that look a bit like a game of Snake played on an old Nokia. I think it makes the network legible as a chain of infinite yet strangely circumscribed possibilities, which are simultaneously navigated and constructed through the desires that it shapes and is shaped by. So there's an accompanying booklet that kind of does the world in here, that does the kind of representational content of the images, that spends a fair amount of time thinking about what is it in this thing, what does it mean, what does it signify, in terms of the representational content of the image. But then you have this kind of stepping back and mapping that occurs alongside it. And I think the maps stage associations between the images. They're structured in ways that lend form to the social and technological systems through which audiences know the images were accessed. It's a kind of visualization of an extended interaction with the network. And I think the white spaces are crucially important in this work in terms of this kind of connective tissue and these alternative possibilities that are not pursued. My final example is a project by an artist, Moira Lovell, who has, in a sense, I think this is kind of closely related to associations. So the process in this instance involves finding photographs of people posing in bits of clothing that they're trying to sell on eBay or on Vinted. Um, and it's typically women posing, kind of transforming themselves into mannequins, I guess. Often in these kind of fairly sexualized poses or kind of provocative poses or suggestive poses. And Lovell prints off the clothing life size. So she can download the picture, print it off, cut it out, and then literally wear it for a series of photographs. So she then poses as the person who was posing in the photograph. And she describes these as images as templates for posing. Um, and there's a kind of, I guess, kind of feminist comedy to these things. There's a kind of awkwardness to her effort to contort herself to inhabit these templates provided by an image world. And in this instance, the kind of it's as though she is traversing the world of Vinted and eBay in search of these things and trying them on and never quite succeeding in inhabiting these things. A bit like, the kind of cut out garments that you get for those paper dolls. And so again, the sort of Vinted algorithm is based on textual searches, prices, user behavior, the language one uses for a search term. So again, there is a sense of kind of moving across and through and around a network, guided by these images, that somehow kind of are and are not part of the world that Lovell is inhabiting. See, Michelle Henning, as I say, has described what I think I'm trying to describe in terms of photography's and the world's mutual interpenetration. A world where our every interaction with images is surveyed and reprocessed in statistical terms to feed a mutable, changing system that will help determine which images we will be served up by the internet, searches, or social media feeds in the future. The images we seek out and are served up, that we share and consume, also shape a sense of self, of individual and collective identities, of subjectivity, in ways that will inform the behaviors that we feed back into the algorithm via our future interaction with images. I think it's interesting, Fornieles talks about cultural algorithms in terms of the kind of behaviors that are informed by images and then kind of inform the images we're subsequently served up. So if we go back to this idea of extracorporeal images, we could say it describes a method and a condition. All networked images are extracorporeal, but not all networked images are extracorporeal images, right? So, so the extracorporeal image is an image that makes this phenomenon visual, palpable to us. The image and the infrastructure somehow made visible simultaneously. Their relation with one another somehow brought into relation. And I think this is the thing that I want to kind of contribute to the conversation today. Is can we think about those two things at the same time? How do we do that? It seems a very complicated thing to do. So it's an image plugged into its infrastructure, so much so that the infrastructure will often, but not always, leave a trace, a sign, a mark. It's the Getty watermark or the white space or this kind of comic, slight but significant jarring between the template and the pose. It's by reading between the image and the process, a process that is, but also isn't the image, that we get a clearest sense of how the world in there shapes and is shaped by the world out here. So I want to kind of slightly complicate the thing, this approach. So I've had kind of conversations with various people, and some have suggested that maybe this would be better conceptualized as a kind of more gaseous entity, as a kind of like the ventilation in an aeroplane, for example. And I kind of considered that, but I also think the risk is that it comes too close to the cloud, as what James Bridle calls the central metaphor for the internet, with this aura or something noumenal and numinous. And actually, I like and think there's something quite productive about the kind of brute materiality of the machine, of actually thinking about infrastructure as something quite concrete. Um, and the kind of other approach I want to bring to this is ownership, right? Is that we can think about what it is to inhabit this world, what it is to kind of be, to simultaneously encounter images and be interacting with all of this infrastructure. But I mean, who owns the infrastructure in the first place? And if my argument is that both image and infrastructure, we encounter something much larger through a part, right? Through some small part, an image as part of a larger world, and our encounter with that image as one kind of small encounter with this much larger infrastructure. I think we can extend that thinking to the socioeconomic arrangements around the infrastructure, particularly in terms of ownership. Now, historically, I've kind of done something a bit like this, talking about labor, and I think that's kind of very much of a kind of millennial efflux, are you working too hard moment. And I think we're past that. I think we're in a much darker place. But I think in a way, the question we need to pose is in a way much more simple. We think kind of who owns this stuff, right? It's I heard this term for the first. It's the broligarchy. Is the term I heard yesterday. The tech bros, but it's the super rich, right? And I'm sorry, it's such a kind of oh, it's the super rich, but I really, it's the only game in town. I think it's the only point that I want to make anytime I get the opportunity to talk public. It's like the world has been bought up by a tiny minority of people who are exercising the most extraordinary level of political power. Um, whether that's Getty, whether that's Zuckerberg, whether it's venture capitalist, billionaire venture capitalist like Schwartz. And historically, across the 20th century, um, only the 20th century, right? We had mechanisms in place as a consequence of strong union power, as a consequence of a certain form of government that promoted forms of redistribution based on wages, based on philanthropy, and based on taxation, right? And what we've seen for the past 40 years is a systematic destruction of that system, the neoliberal precaritization of work, the shrinking of the state, the diminishing of public services. And we face a situation now where governments are in debt, living standards are plummeting, and wealth begets wealth begets wealth. Where we've got this super concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny minority that is becoming more concentrated. And so this shift in focus, this shift from kind of inhabiting the infrastructure to actually think about who owns the infrastructure, is in line with Sarah Kerr's recent argument about wealthity. So she points to the way that social scientists always banging on about poverty as the main social ill. And you say, how do we solve poverty? And you solve poverty by dealing with extreme wealth and the reluctance of extremely wealthy people to pay their taxes. Yeah, the creation of a system that systematically engineers a world where all of the remaining assets are being bought up. But it's why you can't afford a house, right? Is you get passive income on a £700 million, £700 million wealth. You're making multiple millions every year in passive income. What are you going to do with that passive income? You're going to buy more assets, right? That's a good system we're living within at the moment. And this is Gary Stevenson's argument. So why does this concern us? Why is inequality essentially? Why is this hyper concentration of wealth and the ownership of the infrastructure, this infrastructure, but also all the other infrastructure? Why should it concern us? Well, it's broken, right? It's all fucking broken. And what that's gonna, and you've got, in terms of what those corporates, what the billionaire class, in terms of the kind of political power that they're influencing, on the one hand, you see the Gettys of this world, the Schwartzes of this world continuing to back moderate read neoliberal Democrats, right? Who want to maintain the corporate global neoliberal status quo. Or alternately, you've got people jumping shit to the right, where you go. So until there is this insistent narrative, this insistent repeated narrative that the problem is that the world is owned by a tiny minority of people who have no intention of kind of feeding back into the social world, of maintaining the social world, people are going to blame immigrants, right? That people are going to, that's where we are now. And so as far as good, the only game in town is it's tax the rich. Thanks.